So I think this is a little bit more technical and specific session than the previous ones, so let's begin. I will start with the terminology and definitions, with the exemptions and supply chain considerations, the principles for development of a use applied for as such, and then I will go to a bit more to the descriptions of uses as presented in broad information on uses and exposure scenarios, but also about the succinct summary that has already been mentioned. So the terminology, the first definition as listed in the rich text is the use, which is defined as processing, formulation, consumption, storage, keeping, treatment, filling into containers, transfer from one container to another, mixing, production of an article or any other utilization. It's very broad as content, and any of those phrases may come up with the authorization application. Then we have identified use for substance or a mixture, and that's an use as identified by actor in the supply chain, including the own use. That's the registrants, because these have been developed for the registration dossiers. Exposure scenario is a set of conditions, including operational conditions and risk management measures, that are meant to describe how the substance is manufactured and used, and how the effects are supposed to be controlled, effects of the exposure to humans and to environment. Then we go to the sections or the terms referring more specific to authorization. So we have use applied for, which is a use intended use developed by applicants in the authorization dossier. And this describes the use that is applied for, and then for which authorization is granted or not. Broad information on use describes the use applied for. It's prepared by ECHA on the basis of information submitted by the applicant, and it is published on ECHA's website during the public consultation process. As we know, not all uses are subject to authorization. Those that are exempted include scientific research and development, all intermediate uses, uses for which management of risks for human health and environment is already covered by other relevant community legislation. Also, uses related to the manufacturing process and imported articles containing Annex 14 substances are not covered by authorization. The Q&A pages on our website have already been mentioned, and there is quite a lot of further clarification in relation to the exempted uses there as well. Matti has briefly mentioned already the supply chain considerations. So we know already that manufacturers, importers, and downstream users can apply and hold authorizations for their own uses and for the uses down their supply chains. The key word here is down. A downstream user can use a substance without applying or holding an authorization only if he uses the substance in accordance with the conditions of authorization granted to an actor up his supply chain, and he notifies ECHA. Again, there are questions and answers on that. To present it in a more graphic way, manufacturer and importer, the first pyramid. Well, I can't reach it. Anyway, the first pyramid, you see that all levels of the pyramid are covered by the application submitted by the manufacturer or imported. Then the second, the central one, we have the formulator, whose application for authorization would cover the steps down and up only if the manufacturer or importer has no use itself, so it's putting on the market. And if it's a second formulator, the second downstream user applying, then only his end users and his use itself can be covered. How to develop the use applied for? Well, in exposure, in the context of authorization, it includes exposure and risk dimension, and substitution dimension. That's the main difference between the use applied for and identified use, because identified use does not cover the analysis of alternatives, substitution plan, and socioeconomic analysis. So we can see that the application would present the use for which there is a CSR, there is analysis of alternative, substitution plan, and socioeconomic analysis. So we have exposure and substitution elements. And all elements are in each use application. So each element, each analysis of alternatives would be prepared for individual uses. The elements of the description of use applied for include the scope, such as market sector, supply chain elements, processes covered, but also end products, and article life cycle stages, if relevant. The level of detail, well, we need precise information in the name of use, but also in the exposure scenarios and in the assessment reports. The identified uses that's described in the registration can be used as a basis. However, the CSA submitted in the registration is performed at the highest level of the supply chain. So there is a very wide coverage from the top to the bottom. But in this type of coverage, it's not really easy to prepare detailed description for each use, and we quite often see the fairly generic exposure scenarios. So even though we can use it as a basis, we need to refine initial scopes of registered uses to build clear use descriptions for uses applied for. So there is a need to focus on uses in specific market sectors, specific supply chains, process types. We may need to apply for some additional uses, but some uses that are already covered in the registration CSA may not be applied for. Also, the information level is different. The information in the use applied for has to be much more specific and precise. As a result of this more detailed assessment, some elements of the emissions and risk characterizations might be refined too. And then the information that has been prepared for the analysis for the application for authorization, for the CSR elements, may need to be used to amend the registration CSR as well. It has already been mentioned that the assessment reports, all assessment reports, the CSR, analysis of alternatives, substitution plan, and socioeconomic analysis need to be considered in the defining of the use applied for. Basically, what needs to be ensured is that the application is prepared only where the substitution is not possible from technical or economic perspective before the sunset date, and the benefits outweigh the risks. So looking at this example, we have a painting job in different market sectors using different techniques. We have spraying, brushing, and dipping used in manufacture of wood articles, plastic articles, and vehicles. And then we can see that for some uses, like in manufacturing of vehicles, there are already suitable alternatives, whether substances or processes. There are also available alternatives for some of the procs, or one of the procs each, for the manufacturing of wood articles and manufacturing of plastic articles. Therefore, the application for authorization would not be prepared for all three types of applications, but only for two, and would have a limited scope. So there would be not all three types of applications would be covered in both authorizations. And whether it's indoor or outdoor use, it's an additional refinement that would be included in the exposure scenario. As with the registrations, not all applications have to be submitted by individual companies. The joint applications are also a possibility. There is several permutations possible. Let's start with the simplest one. When we have a applicant A and applicant B, they have the same use or very similar use. They submit very similar CSRs and exposure scenarios. However, the analysis of alternatives, substitution plans, and socioeconomic analysis would be different for both applicants. There are also more complex situations where we have a group of applicants submitting together for the same substance. However, none of the uses are shared. There is also a range of other options with variety of permutations again. And all of that is possible to submit. Broad information on uses presents a description of use that has been developed for the public consultation, basically. So it is a set of public information related to the use of Annex 14 substance, its purpose, the conditions of use and functional requirements, and the suitability of alternatives. In here we have a bit of a trade-off between the meaningfulness and the level of detail and confidentiality. So far we have been able to achieve the ratio of 90-10 for public versus confidential. The more public information and the less confidential, the better. Why do we prepare this package? Well, we need to present the information on our website to gather relevant and meaningful information on positive alternatives during the public consultation. Not every company has a research base sufficient to ensure that everything is covered. So the companies applying for authorization may benefit from experiences from other players on the market. And all the information available has to be taken into account in the decision making, in the authorization granting. So we have the application as submitted, and use applied for is described as a username, as exposure scenarios, and the analysis of alternatives, and use descriptors. And on the basis of this information, ECHA develops brief wording on the use, presenting the function of the substance. The applicant has a possibility to prepare a draft, and it's better from the applicant's perspective to do it, because what we see here is the function of the substance is one of the elements that is required. And the applicant is the only one that knows why the substance is so unique, what functions the substance provides that is so difficult to replace with other substances or with other processes. CSRs, analysis of alternatives, substitution plan, and socioeconomic analysis also are among the documents that will be published on our website. So basically, the structure of the broad information on uses, the text would be like that. We prepare it as a sort of a Word document, so it's not a table form, but that's the elements of the content. And this middle part is the one where the input from the applicant is mostly beneficial. Once we develop the introductory brief wording, this document is sent then to the applicant, and the applicant can comment on it. And then the final wording is agreed on, and once the invoice is paid, the brief information on use package is published. Matti and Sanna have already talked about the timelines of what happens after the publication. I can only add the information submitted during the public consultation is published as well, and it's it's used in the developing thinking for the RAC and SAC members whether there is a need to have trialogue, so whether we need to discuss the content of the information provided. Key messages are fairly simple. In the development of the use descriptions, use of descriptor systems is very appreciated. Clear descriptions of functions are needed. The original or generic descriptions of uses as provided in the registration CSRs are needed. And the final scope of uses, analysis of alternatives and analysis is via iterative process. I have added the link before the website was updated, so I'm not 100% sure it's still current. And then the scope and level of detail in the brief information on use, the more precise it is, the more likely it is that the results of the public consultations will be meaningful. And again, there is the same disclaimer about the website. The same. Good. Now I have few words to say about description of use in the exposure scenario. And I will assume here that the consistency between the exposure scenario and Euclid, as mentioned by Christian, is already ensured. The definition of the exposure scenario I talked about before, and we all know that it's an element of the chemical safety assessment presented in the chemical safety report as submitted during registration, but it is also a required part of the application for authorization. This is part of the application that actually, other than authorization-specific guidance, is available for. We are talking about guidance on information requirements in chemical safety assessment, which has a number of specific chapters dedicated to different sections of the exposure scenario. Exposure scenario is very important because it's one of the key elements on the basis of which the opinion on authorization is developed. And it's very relevant for both threshold and non-threshold substances. So regardless whether the substance goes through adequate control route or socio-economic route, doesn't matter. The exposure scenarios will be analyzed by RAC and quite in depth, I have to say. Each use is divided into a series of contributing scenarios for workers' exposure, presenting individual tasks and elements of the process. There is also usually one environmental contributing scenario presenting local and regional exposure. For substances that are listed in Annex 14 for human health endpoints, the assessment will be only for the man via environment. The exposure scenarios include description of the use and actually exposure assessment. Description of use in a narrative form allows the committees to visualize the task and conditions under which the use occurs. And that's really important, because to make an informed decision about the risk management measures, the adequacy, the committee members need to understand what's happening. To state that parts are taken off the jig is not sufficient. We need to describe. You need a description for that. We need a description, the same as if the parts are put into the cleaning bath. It also needs description of how it's done. Therefore, the diagrams, photos, short video clips, anything that would facilitate the understanding of the workplace, its layout, will be more than welcome. The second element is the actual exposure assessment. And again, it's for the environment and for the workers. For the environment, it's local and regional. Inhalation and oral, that's for the man via environment. For each worker contributing scenario, we have a separate estimation of exposure via inhalation and dermal. But what is also expected is that there will be an assessment of the average working day exposure. So it's possible that a worker is not involved only one task, but in a group of tasks. So we need to know about that as well. The description or the assessment of exposure include elements such as the operational conditions and risk management measures. So the physical form of the substance, its concentration, the duration and frequency of exposure, the risk management measures that have been used, the efficiencies if needed. All of that needs to be presented. And then we have the exposure estimations. It's the key element of the assessment, and it can be done via modeling or the measured data can be used. The modeling can be, there is a variety of exposure modeling tools, so the consideration has to be given to the applicability of the tool. The input parameters used need to be presented, so we know the RAC members have to be able to replicate the analysis. The measured data, air monitoring or biological monitoring, can be used on its own, or it can be used to support the modeling. It needs to be representative of the task. It needs to be representative of the use. So if we have the representativeness for the use, I have on mind here the number of data points in relation to the tasks. So if we have only one incidence of measurements, we need to ask ourselves a question: can we actually base the exposure scenario and exposure assessment on that? If we have a use that is common, that is occurring in a few hundreds of workplaces, how many companies need to provide the information on the exposures to have actually a representative sample? And then the measured data or the modeling, results of the modeling are used in the risk characterization. So we need to know what these figures mean. So we need to know how to interpret them. So we have either RCR for the substances with the threshold, so it's a ratio of the exposure to the DNL, or we have excess cancer risk for the non-threshold substances. And that's figure. What is very important is that the description of use applied for and the operational conditions and exposure levels are as specific to actually use conditions as possible. We do realize that it's easier for the downstream users, more difficult for the applications coming from the higher levels in the supply chain, but still we need, at least the range needs to be provided. Succinct summary that has already been mentioned as well. Well, authorization is a new process. CSRs as submitted can be very complex and very extensive. At this stage, national enforcement authorities do not have much experience in the enforcement of authorization decisions, especially considering that so few of them have already been given. So, REACH committee has agreed that a summary of the key risk management measures and operational conditions in a succinct format should be or would help the enforcement authorities. Therefore, succinct summary as a table summarizing the relevant operational conditions and risk management measures, which are presented in more detail in the other parts of the application documentation in the CSR, and being an extract of the full set of conditions described in the CSR are needed, and they should be submitted with the CSR. It is a mandatory information and will be reviewed by RAC. In the consultation, have developed a format of the succinct summary. This is the first proposal, so it's possible that it will change in the future. But this is how it would look like. So we have here the tasks identifiers, we have the tonnages, the risk management measures, both technical and organizational. We have the personal protective equipment and other conditions, but the same type of information for the environmental information as well, but also the reference to the CSR. So this table will become a part of authorization application and part of the dossier itself, but it will also be included in the decision from the Commission. So this summary, as being easy to translate, presenting full set of operational conditions and risk management measures included in the exposure scenarios, would be used by the national enforcement authorities to facilitate the decision-making and authorization enforcement. Thank you very much.